Hey guys, welcome to Supposedly Fun. I'm Greg. Today I wanted to talk to you about two books that I just finished, and kind of similar to when I did a review of both Adele and The Terrible at the same time. It's funny how when you read two books back to back, they can feel like they're linked, even though strictly speaking they are not. So both of these books kind of deal with the idea of survival, although they are very different. One is literally an apocalyptic novel, and the other one just kind of feels that way. And I want to talk about the one that I really liked first. That is Unsheltered by Barbara Kingsolver. I mentioned it already in my wrap up for February, but I wanted to talk about it at length because the further I get away from having read this book, the more I really like it. Only gave it 4 stars on Goodreads. I almost thought about upping it. This is one of those situations where you wish that they had like a 0.5 star, because I do think there are flaws in the book, but I can't stop thinking about it. And there are so many things that I really like about it, so I almost want to up it to 5 stars. So Barbara Kingsolver's books have always been socially conscious. This goes all the way back to her first book, which was 1988's The Bean Trees, which if you haven't read it is a very good book. It's about a woman who leaves rural Kentucky to escape what she deems to be the fate of all young women in Kentucky, which is early pregnancy and motherhood, and just a quiet life. And then she unexpectedly finds herself in Arizona saddled with a Native American toddler, and her life turns out completely different from what she had wanted it to be, but nevertheless makes her happy. It's a very good book. So all the way going back to that, and if you talk about the Poisonwood Bible, which I have here, this is one of my favorite books. I really love it. It's about a missionary family in Africa and had the conflicts that they run into. It's a fascinating book. If you haven't read the Poisonwood Bible, check it out. So if you follow Barbara Kingsolver, you always see this kind of socially conscious angle in her books. She has recently been writing a lot about the environment as well, and that follows into Unsheltered. But what's interesting about her and why I think she's a successful novelist is that she never feels like she's scolding you, and she never feels like she's beating you over the head with her themes or some kind of overarching lesson within her books. This is pulled off particularly well in Unsheltered, I think, because there are a lot of scenes in which characters have discussions or debates about quote-unquote big issues. They reflect on the state of the world or how they expected things to be or politics, and I can see where somebody would feel like they're being talked back and forth about issues, but I think Kingsolver is really even-handed on these. She never tells you this side is right or this side is wrong. She basically presents both sides of a conversation to you, the reader, and lets you make up your own mind. And she basically just gives you a lot of things to think about. And I enjoyed that structure. I liked the way she prodded me into thinking about things without making me feel like she was trying to point me in a particular direction. So there are 2 storylines in Unsheltered. The first one follows Willa Knox and her family. Willa it's set in the near present. It's shortly after Hurricane Sandy devastated the coast of New Jersey and into New York City and all the way up to Vermont. That time period was not chosen by accident. Willa has been a successful journalist, but her magazine folded. It just collapsed, and she lost her job, and she has not been able to get any kind of freelance career off the ground yet. Her husband, Yano, has been a professor, and he lost his tenured position at a college when the college unexpectedly closed, and he has been forced to take it's a big step down for him. You could really call it a humiliating position for someone with his academic credentials and stature, but he had to take it in order to make money for his family. And so he and Willa moved to Vineland, New Jersey, which is a real town. And I did not know that when I read this book. Somebody pointed it out to me after I finished it, and I had to look into it, which is one of the things that's fascinating about this book, is finding out what parts of it are real and what parts are fictional, and how Barbara Kingsolver used these real locations and some real people to further her story. And now that they're in Vineland, Willa and her family are living in a house that they inherited, which is literally falling apart. The structure was built very badly, and their house is just coming down around them. They cannot live there for very long. And right there, we arrive at one of Barbara Kingsolver's big themes, which is, of course, shelter. And what's really interesting about this book is she approaches the idea of shelter from a lot of different areas and points of view. There is the literal idea of shelter as a home, but there's also the shelter provided by careers and stability and institutions. Again, it's no accident that Willa and her husband have lost their jobs. Magazines used to be one of the most stable things in the world, but we live in a world where media is changing and very different. And the colleges you would think would be sturdy. All of these institutions that are supposed to be reliable have collapsed. The world we grew up with is not the world we live in now. So there's a sense that the world is breaking apart and things that we relied on don't exist, which leaves us feeling unsteady, exposed, and unsure. This is furthered by the idea of shelter as provided by a parent. Willa's father-in-law lives with them, and he is seriously on the decline. He's dying. So Willa and her husband have taken on the role of caregiver for him. So there's been a shift in who's sheltering who, but they don't have the money to provide for him in the way that he needs, and they don't have the health insurance to get him the health care that he needs, which is very sad and devastating. Willa's children, Tig and Zeke, have also moved in with them. Zeke is crippled by debt because he pursued an education, so this book kind of gets at that idea of how things like healthcare and education are really expensive to the point where they're prohibitive for people to pursue. And Zeke also has a son. His longtime girlfriend has recently committed suicide, leaving him as a single parent. And Tig and Willa have to take on the role of caregivers for this baby, who is just this helpless being whose uncertain future really resonates across all of Kingsolver's characters. Tig is really her brother's opposite. While he pursues financial success and traditional forms of success, Tig is bracing for the uncertainty of the world. She sees what he's doing as kind of useless and futile, because basically he is trying to create an app that will help people make money on the stock market or through investments. So he is trying to make money by helping people who are already wealthy make more money, while everybody else just kind of languishes on the bottom. And Tig is basically making a case that all of these financial institutions are collapsing, so the things that her brother is pursuing aren't going to be relevant anymore. And we should be defining success in other ways. We should be trying to live in other ways. We need to be sustainable. We need to be thinking about things so we can, without waste. And this is where the environment comes in, because Tig really believes that the environment is disintegrating and our waste is coming back to get us. And again, that's where it feels resonant that this novel is set right in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. And Kingsolver never beats you over the head with it, but there are references back to Hurricane Sandy and things that are going on with the environment that make all of this stuff sing, if you will. Basically, Willa and her family have done everything right, but the world that they were promised has failed them, and they're grasping for shelter where they can find it. They're grasping for comfort. They're trying to figure out where they're going to land. The second storyline is set in the 1880s, and it follows Thatcher Greenwood, who lives in the same house that Willa and her family now live in. In Thatcher's timeline, the town of Vineland is newly established, and it's kind of utopian. It has all these ideals, but Thatcher finds that this utopian identity is not quite accurate. It's very superficial. It does not get very deep. Thatcher runs afoul of the town's political and spiritual leaders because he teaches evolution to his students. And this is a very controversial idea. He gets forced into a debate about evolution in the town. And the fact that evolution is still a controversial subject today really makes this section kind of poignant and kind of maddening in a way. You can see the roots of the modern fake news bubble that proliferates on social media happening in society even back then, and it's just really well done. And it almost kind of, one reason I always like history books is that it reminds me that things have always been terrible, and Barbara Kingsolver does that here as well. And it's alternately comforting to know that things have always been terrible, but it can also be infuriating and galvanizing. And I think that's a really big strength of Barbara Kingsolver's as a writer. And there we get another idea of shelter. The citizens of Vineland in Thatcher's time are sheltering themselves in the version of the world that gives them comfort. They don't want to have to think about things differently. They don't want to be challenged. They would rather continue with the world as it is, even if doing so will ultimately cause more harm in the long term. Thatcher's story also features a woman named Mary Treat, who is a real-life woman, and I didn't know that when I read the book. So it's been interesting finding out about her. She is uneducated formally, because she's a woman in the 1880s. But she was very smart. She makes a living publishing articles in scientific magazines. She was a collaborator of Charles Darwin. She's a fascinating character, and finding out that she was real it's just one of the joys of this book. And interestingly, although there are no looming disasters in Unsheltered, it does feel like an apocalyptic novel, because there's a sense that there's an upheaval going on, and the world we live in is changing so drastically that we don't really know where it's going. So you get a sense of looming disaster, even though nothing is quite on the scale of apocalypse in this novel. Now, like I said, I don't think this is a perfect book, but I give it my heartiest recommendation, because I really enjoyed it, and I really love the way it made me think about topics. And I finished this about a week and a half ago, and I'm still thinking about it. I'm still enjoying talking about it. So I would definitely recommend checking this book out. I listened to the audio version. Barbara Kingsolver herself read it, and she did a great job. It's funny though, because she has an accent, and I fully thought it was going to be a Wisconsin accent, but I looked it up and she's from Maryland, so I guess that's where the accent is from. But she does a great job reading the book. I would recommend doing it that way. I want to go back sometime when I can get a physical copy of this book, because I feel like I want to go and kind of take notes and note down some things with it, which is probably the highest praise that I can heap upon any novel. Then we get to The Age of Miracles by Karen Thompson Walker, which was the first book that I have finished in the month of March. I did not pick this book up when it first came out. It kind of caught my eye, but I got a little confused, because some people talked about it as if it was YA, but some people talk about it as if it's science fiction, some people talk about it as if it's literary fiction, and it sounded kind of confused, so I didn't really expect to pick it up. But I've heard so many good things about this book, and people who loved it, here on BookTube and on Instagram, especially because Karen Thompson Walker just released a new book called The Dreamers, and everybody was talking about, oh, I can't wait to read The Dreamers because I love The Age of Miracles. And that got me really looking forward to this, so I got the audiobook, and I didn't like it. It's okay, but I just couldn't get into it. The premise is really interesting. So the premise is that we follow an 11-year-old girl named Julia. She turns 12 in the course of the book, and she's telling the story from some time later. Basically, the world starts to slow down. They call this the slowing. Earth's rotation slows down. So that has all kinds of impacts on the world. And the science of it is supposed to be pretty accurate. Karen Thompson Walker had this book checked by an astrophysicist. So the science is supposed to be at least fairly accurate for what would happen if the world did slow down. And you don't really think about a lot of the impacts right away, but it's interesting because like birds are one of the first people to be affected. Gravity is changed because gravity is a result of how fast the Earth spins. The Earth's magnetic field is impacted, tides are impacted, and all of these changes happen and get more and more severe as the book progresses. But the book kind of feels like, although it's definitely engaging in those topics, it almost feels like that's happening in the background, because Julia's concerns are very much the concerns of a preteen girl, although at times I feel like she's written as somebody who's older, like a teenager. When you're 11 or 12 years old, you're still on the cusp of you're still a child, but you're not quite a teenager. And Julia never felt to me like she was straddling that divide. She fully feels like a teenager to me, so I kind of struggled with her age. I kept forgetting. Like I thought she was 16, and then she starts celebrating her 12th birthday, and I was like, oh right, she's 11. And it's just, I wrote a really snarky review of this. I'll link that down below, where I kind of did a play act where there's like a TV news thing saying, oh my god, birds are falling out of the sky, where the power grid's going to run out, and it feels like the characters aren't listening to it at all. Like it almost feels like it would make more sense if this had devolved into like a Mad Max thing where people are fighting over fuel and resources, and instead the biggest conflict is about what time it is. There are people who call themselves real-timers, who believe that the clocks should be structured around the length of the day. So as days get longer, clocks don't matter because you should tell time based on when the sun rises and when the sun sets. And they will stay awake, if they can, as long as the day is. So when days are 50 hours, they expect to stay up for 50 hours. And then there are other people who believe that we should use the existing clocks that we have and just cycle them around and, you know, stay on our regular 24-hour cycle, even though technically days are longer than that. And this is the divide that people break themselves along, and they shun people. The clock timers shun people who are real timers. They get driven out of town. And I remember I was reading and I was thinking, I mean, this is interesting because, of course, how do you define time when days get longer? But is this really where society would break down? Shouldn't it be breaking down over something else? And I just couldn't get away from that idea. I do think that there's an astute point that Karen Thompson Walker is trying to get to, where she constantly reminds us that we have set these structures. We define what time it is. And no matter how much order we try to impose on the world is not going to define itself based on our terms. And chaos is the way of the world. And things will continue to devolve. And, you know, I think that's something else she's trying to get to, where it feels like people are being frivolous when the world is ending. And I think what she's trying to get at there is that we don't really, a lot of people don't really take dramatic action against things like climate change. We kind of, you know, it's a serious issue, but a lot of people are kind of hoping, well, maybe it'll be okay, you know, and maybe I don't really need to worry about solar panels, or maybe we don't need to push harder for hybrid cars or sustainability. So I think she's trying to make some astute points there, but I just couldn't get into the way these characters act about these things. It feels like the serious thing is happening and they're just going about their day. And, you know, if you disagree with me, let me know. Let's talk about it. Because I do think there are parts of this book that were well done, but for the most part, it just felt maddening to me. Like, why are you worrying about this? Especially because since an 11-year-old girl is our main character, her biggest concern seems to be whether or not this boy in her class, Seth, is interested in her. And meanwhile, you know, she may not live to adulthood as far as she knows. And it constantly felt off to me. So there you have it. 2 books about survival in the modern world. If you disagree with me about any of these, again, please feel free to leave me a comment. Let's talk about it. If you agree, I'd still love to hear from you. If you have not read Barbara Kingsolver, I definitely recommend Unsheltered, or check out The Poison of a Bible, The Bean Trees. You can't go wrong with any book of hers that I have read, I have liked so far. There are a couple that I haven't gotten to. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. I really appreciate any time. I know I talked a lot about Unsheltered, so I appreciate the time you've invested in this. And if you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing to my channel or watching some of my other videos. I'll be back again, and until then, happy reading, everybody.